boom, that was an unintentional boom. That was the boom mic hitting the USB cable and falling. So yes, we have multiple types of booms there. Good to see you all. Welcome to Tokyo Tonight. My name is Hiko Simon. I'm here at the same time every week, Japan Standard Time, 10:30 p.m. So yes, if Japan doesn't have daylight saving time, so that makes it easier in some ways. Although of course, if you're changing times wherever you are, it's always the same time. Look it up in Japan time. Yeah, so good to see you all. Already people in there, even though I only put up the notification for this about 10 minutes ago, so really do appreciate that. Great to see so many people already in the comments. Starting with Odie Jr. Booms, boom, 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 boom emoji. Good to see. Good to have you in here. We've got Quint Ranked. Good to see you. Andrea Moboy, good to have our resident Melbourne viewer an hour ahead, so late at night. I do appreciate. We've also got Savis Musician. Good to see you. Have a hippopotamus of a time. The hippopotamus, I guess you could say, to borrow a name. Yes, we've got Ko Hoshino. Good to see you. Indeed, Odie Jr. worried that I wouldn't make it, but I did. Just to just to get the show started, I decided I'd show up. Ko Hoshino, good to see you back. Good to see you in a couple of recent episodes. So yeah, technical features not today. So far, touch wood, boom, boom, everything working so far. We've got Mr. Cordy Chep just in time. Yes, you made it. Indeed, you're most welcome, Andrea. Glad to be here. Who else we got in here? We've got Aaron. Good to see Aaron, moderator and video editor extraordinaire. Thank you again for putting up the videos during the week. Always really, really appreciate that and the moderation duties. Yeah, AV84K, literal boom. My boom. I caused a boom on the boom that my mic was on. So there we go. I had very meta there. Tokyo 503, decent performance by Japan with the Lions last night. Indeed, I watched the game recorded today. Yeah, I thought they did pretty good. Although that said, I know how this works. The Lions were not. They were being careful to treat the game as a sort of a warm-up match for their players and not to show too much of what they have planned for when they go to South Africa and so on. So honestly, I think that they were playing the game deliberately as like a practice defense and let Japan sort of run at them. But Japan played pretty well. The fact that the Lions only let Japan score one try, it looked to me like Japan could have maybe scored again. But that was probably the whole objective for the Lions. So, you know, I saw some accounts that thought it was lopsided, but yeah, I thought Japan played pretty well. I don't have that as one of the stories today, so I'll mention it. But yes, indeed, I thought Japan played pretty respectably anyway. Oh, and I agree with you, Japan unlucky not to score more. But yeah, again, I think that was kind of what the Lions were aiming at. For those of you who don't know, the Lions are a rugby team made up of the two Irelands, which play together. The Irish rugby team is actually Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. They play with the unified team normally. But the Lions are a team made up of Wales, England, Scotland, and Ireland together, the best players, and they're off to a tour of South Africa, I think. So yeah, they played a warm-up game with Japan, and yeah, Japan did okay. Although, yeah, I do always wonder if they would be playing better if they still had a team in the Super Rugby competition, but we'll see. Yeah, Tudom, good to see you. Hello, brother, indeed. Hello right back, Tudom. Konbanwa, Kohoshino, good to see you. Sergeant Bilko, yes, hand raised, good to see you. Waito-san, good to see Waito-san. Hey, long time no see, Waito-san. I don't know if you're a rugby fan, but I guess you might be looking forward to the upcoming Lions matches. We've got Ed Avoid, morning from Arizona. Good to have Arizona back in the house. We also have anyone else? Who else do we have in here? We have Schadenfreude. It's funny how you can read that even when you take the things out. First time you join, welcome. You get a shout out just for showing up. So yeah, welcome to the chat. Welcome to the show. Hope you enjoy it. Who else we got in here? We got 2270 AJ. Good to see 270 AJ. Tour de France started last night, by the way, points out Andrea Moboy. Good to see. Yeah, actually watched Kimi no Nawa today. I haven't seen that movie. I watch less movies, but this was very good. Art music story. I've heard very good things about that movie, including from non-Japanese movie fans. So it sounds like of the Japanese movies I should watch, that's like at the top of the list. Kimi no Nawa. What's the English name for that? It's funny. It plays on the fact that there are like 20 different words for you in Japanese, and it's kind of I understand that the concept is like it's a Freaky Friday type of concept, but you know, Japanese anime sort of thing, and it's meant to be very, very well done. So I should check that out. Kerberos Tenshi, good to see Kerberos Tenshi. Your Samsung still standing relatively strong after 6 years. That's pretty good. The old iPhone is definitely not holding up that well. So congrats on the Samsung doing that well. Dan H, good to see you as always. Dan H, Christopher Luke, Springboks are all in quarantine. Oh, is that right? I did not know that. We've got Marco Fernandez. Good to have Marco Fernandez here. Hey, Marco, right back at you. We've got PB. Greetings, Sergio. You heard that New Zealand won the World Cricket Test Championships. Really, I didn't even know that they were on, although I'm in Japan, so I guess I wouldn't know. But yeah, that's funny. New Zealand's kind of like, you know, if we have a couple of good players, we do okay. But, you know, we don't really have the population like Australia or UK to have like a lot of depth. But, oh, it must be doing quite well right now. Butter stocks are strong. Always good to see. It's always a good sign of the economy, how butter is doing. Your name. That's right, Barry Convex. Your name. Thank you for the correction there. And yes, in New South Wales, orders stay at home. That sounds inappropriate. I don't know. I'm sure. I think you probably meant to type home there. I've heard it's been pretty. I mean, Australia does look a little bit wild down there. How like seriously, we're going up by 120% week over week every day this week. The situation in Tokyo is that we are now like going back up to 500 something cases a day, and the same day on the previous week, typically more than 100 cases increasing. I.e., this week it's going to be 600 something cases a day. Next week it's probably going to be 800 cases a day, and people are thinking that by the time the Olympics starts, we could be up to, and this is without factoring in the people that are going to be arriving for the Olympics, and already people from multiple teams coming in and testing positive, and that's kind of expected, and they are being isolated. But we could be up to like, you know, easily more than 1,000 people a day just in the normal course. No one really cares. I don't know. It's kind of funny how, you know, New South Wales freaks out at like 12 people, and you know, or Australia freaks out at 12 people, and treat New South Wales like it's some sort of enemy country, and up here we're chilling out at like 600 people a day. But I guess it's just different approaches. Some good news which I will talk about tonight about vaccinations, including I got the chance actually to reserve a vaccination myself, although only the first shot, and I'm thinking, you know what, I'm probably going to get a voucher in the next week or so, hopefully. So if I get the voucher, I might just actually go up to the military vaccination center, or might even be able to get one on a cancel list somewhere near here, actually, if I get the voucher anyway. So it looks like I'm gonna have a lot of options to get vaccinated, well, at least to get my first shot during July, which I'm looking forward to. And to me, that's really it. I mean, you know, the lockdown thing, it's impressive what Australia's done without vaccinations, how well they've controlled it. But here it's gonna be there's no way out of this other than vaccination. So we'll see how that goes. Australia freaks out at one indeed. They're worried because it is the Delta variant. Yes, we'll be talking about that. In fact, yeah, there's a lot to catch up on that. I don't have a lot of stories tonight. I know I've said this before. It is 10:40 p.m. We'll see how I go. Will I do more than 2 stories in the first 20 minutes? You know I never do, but we'll see how I go at it. Yeah, there's a bit going on with coronavirus. There's some other stories, but again, I've just had a really, really busy time with work. I've been tweeting less, which makes it good. There's less stuff to filter through to pick out topics for the show. So yeah, let's dive into it. Congrats, Kerberos Tenshi. You've got your shots July 9 and August 20. Good on you. Yeah, PB, I was definitely about to get onto that. Like Delta Plus. I've flown Delta and been upgraded before, and I think that was Delta Plus. I'm very confused. Yeah. But anyway, with that said, you got to stream your runs, mate, says Marco Fernandez. Well, I thought about that. I mean, I don't want to, you know, given that I'm running from home, I suppose I shouldn't really care that much. I must admit, if I got an Insta 360 like Victor has, that you can put on a stick and has awesome stabilization even when you're running, yeah, I'd be pretty tempted to do live streaming. And in fact, Aaron actually suggested that I should do live streaming. I'm tempted, but we'll see how we go. Dan H, has there been any controversy in Japan over giving 1.2 million Oxford vaccines to Taiwan, a rich country, as well as increased cases in Japan? No one here wants the AstraZeneca shots, and the fact that Japan gave a bunch to Taiwan and then gave a bunch to Vietnam as well, which again, the number one source of foreign residents of Japan, so it kind of makes sense as well. No, giving it to Taiwan was like a parade. People here love Taiwan. The fact that Taiwan's efforts to try to purchase AstraZeneca and Pfizer vaccines from other companies, that those commercial deals were scuppered by allegedly by China, telling those companies that they'd be banned from China if they sold to Taiwan or they recognized Taiwanese sovereignty, and they sort of managed to veto those deals, and so Taiwan wasn't able to buy from anyone. And Japan's decided that they're not going to use the AstraZeneca vaccines. Just the probably overreacting to the side effect news, but also they have enough stocks for the entire population just from Pfizer and Moderna, which have also, the data shows that it's more effective. So yeah, no controversy at all supporting Taiwan for that, or Vietnam either, actually. And we'll see. And Japan at the G7 meeting was actually one of the lead proponents, saying that they should, developing nations should take responsibility for making sure that developed nations get them. Makes sense in Japan's case as well, that you'd focus on countries that produce a lot of immigrants to Japan. I mean, that's ultimately the point, right? People from developing nations end up in developed nations, and so it's actually self-interest to make sure that developing nations are vaccinated. And sure, if you've got to pick out of 200 countries, why not pick the ones that you have the closest human ties to first? So not that Taiwan is in a developing nation basket at all, but the fact that they're being screwed over by China just makes it extra. Japan fell over itself donating the vaccines to Taiwan, and just as we are enjoying the Taiwanese pineapples that have been blocked from China, we didn't hesitate. Squirrel, I've done it, Aaron. Yes, you are correct. I gotta answer the people when they ask questions like that, and that was a good one, Dan H. Can I get your vaccine shots? They've run out of Pfizer in Australia, says Andrea Mobway. I'm sorry to hear that. Good to see Ninjaroo in there. Good to see you, Ninjaroo. Atomic Tom, good to see you. Not showing your home is smart, in my opinion. Yeah, well, not not needlessly anyway. I would like to live stream a run, and maybe I could go somewhere and go for a run, and I would like to try that sometime, but I don't really have the equipment for it right now, and I wouldn't do it from an iPhone. It would just be horrible. You'd all get motion sickness. Yeah, maybe if that's your thing, but no. And plus, I'd probably drop the phone. Rambling, thank you. I'm a rambling man. That's a Waylon Jennings song. I'm doing it again. Juan Johnson, good to see you. Which coup am I able to tell? Are you giving your voucher? So I'm in one of the coups in Tokyo, one of the wards in Tokyo that hasn't issued vouchers yet for people under 65, but which is there's 9 of them. But yeah, should be coming out in the next week or so, as with all of them. So that's why. Butter emojis are working. That's interesting to see. Christopher Luke, I think I said hello to you earlier, but I'll just say it again just in case. And Lysander 45, you had to rebook your second shot twice. I'm sorry to hear about all the drama, but good to see you there. Let's dive into it now. Let's start the show. A bit croaky tonight. Let me have a drink. Alrighty. Okay. First of all, some people are talking about Delta and Delta Plus. So what's going on with coronavirus in Japan this week? Well, first thing is, of course, it is funny in Japan, although, for obvious political correctness and sensitivity reasons, we're being encouraged, just like with the Wuhan virus, we were corrected to, switching over to the coronavirus. And then to COVID-19, again, probably out of fear of hurting the feelings of other coronaviruses. In Japan, they've always been a bit slow, where even though there's COVID-19 in English media, Japanese media just stuck with coronavirus. That's just what it caught on. And similarly, although we have the Delta variant, obviously the Indian variant, and people calling them the Indian variant, the Brazilian variant, the English or the British variant. And again, there were sort of sensitivities about that, not wanting to beat up on India. Obviously, we're trying to get everyone to switch over to India, to Delta variant. But in Japan, they still say Delta variant, which means it's from India. They always put it in the parentheses in the news. So I don't know if they're really helping with that. Not that I think it's causing too much of a problem yet. The fact that the fact that Delta Plus has happened, I mean, like I say, I remember getting upgraded on Delta, and I can't help but hear Delta Plus and just think, wow, that sounds nice. No, that doesn't sound nice. I must say, out of all of them, I mean, Corona's a pretty decent beer as well, so I must admit, who knows? I mean, once this is all done, I could be flying back to America. I might just have a Corona beer to celebrate on my Delta flight to Seattle, next flight that I take over there. Who knows? But anyway, that's happening. Delta, definitely the numbers are going up, and it clearly is more contagious. Interesting, however, that in Tokyo, the numbers of people over 65 who are about nearly 50% vaccinated, it's about 40% of the people over 65 are vaccinated now, something like that. The numbers of new cases involving people in those highly vaccinated groups are coming down, which shows that it's effective. There again, of course, in Israel, where everyone is pretty much vaccinated, at least inside Israel proper. And they are, with the Pfizer, with the same mRNA vaccines that they're planning to use in Japan, or are using in Japan, of course, the Delta variants are present there, and they are actually causing lots of new cases, even in a highly vaccinated country, and people are going back to requiring masks. I get a feeling Japan is just going to stick with masks. Japan already had a custom of using masks in the first place. So the idea that everyone's itching to get rid of them, I think they're going to stay, particularly in big cities, for a while after this. But yeah, it's scary, and clearly we are going to get another wave. I mean, this is the other thing. Numbers in Tokyo, in fact, I don't think I have a graph with the numbers of Tokyo, only the vaccinations. But like I said, our number is 1.2. It's 100, week over week, cases are going up by 120% over the same day of the previous week at the moment, which is equating to around 120 cases. It's now going from it's basically jumping 450 to 550, 560. So the numbers are going up again alarmingly. We've only been out of the state of emergency in Tokyo for like a week. Not that it's really much of a state of emergency, but they're going to put them back. There are no restrictions on Japanese people, says Christopher Liu. Kind of. There's no restrictions. There's no requirements to stay at home, or no bans on going out, although that's discouraged. It's mostly restrictions on Japanese businesses, for example, particularly so many cases are linked to alcohol consumption, and so bars, izakaya, places like that are told that they can't serve alcohol after 7 p.m., which, typically people who drink do it on the way home from work, after work at 7. So if everything's closed at 7, the idea is to discourage people going out. Of course, some people poking fun that it's not like you can't catch coronavirus, or you can't, somehow drinking during the day is any less risky a behavior than drinking in the evening. But, the idea is it's trying to softly modify behavior without doing things like in Paris, where people are banned from going out, like a kind of actual lockdown, and people have to explain why they're out. They're more shutting down the places that people go to that involve the most likely to produce clusters. That said, of course, kids are going to schools, people are going to work, and there are clusters at works, gyms, schools, and none of those are shut down. So yeah, you're basically right there, Christopher Luke. And this is where even those kind of soft restrictions have been kind of eased, like within a week of them being eased, the numbers in Tokyo are just shooting up again. So already they're talking about we're probably going to be back in another state of emergency, maybe within the next week, depending on the number of serious cases and the hospital bed situation, which is actually, because elderly are not catching it so much, is not going up too badly, although there's also always a bit of a delay from when the numbers go up to when the serious cases come up, since most cases tend to get serious about a week or two after the numbers come out. So this is kind of funny, very different to Australia. Japan doesn't freak out at the idea of there being a case, but they will freak out if there are so many serious cases that the hospitals can't cope, and then they'll put in some pretty soft restrictions, but that's how it's been working. That said, like I said, the really Japan's kind of given up on trying to control by lockdown. They've been doing these kind of trying to turn the knob to try to control the amount of the spikes when the waves have been coming in. But really, right now they're fully invested in vaccinating. And interesting to see, I think I showed last week how Japan was sort of had this very, very spiking sort of a graph. And right now it's just jumped ahead of Germany, Italy, France, I don't know why Europe would be there. This is per 100 people, so that's across all of Europe. So this is actually against the population. This is not raw numbers. This is against the population. So also consider the fact that Japan is now issuing more vaccines per day, or per 7-day average per 100 people in the population than Germany. And of course, Japan has like 3 times the population, I think, of Germany. Maybe it's double. I don't know. What is Germany as? Like 40 million, 50 million? But anyway, Tokyo, Japan, 120 million people, and the number's still going like this. Canada, by the way, is apparently still way, way above. But it shows that Japan started late. If you take the surface area of that line, it shows that Japan still hasn't covered as much as these other countries that have been doing this better for a longer time. But certainly they got their act together, and, this is where now it does look very achievable that everyone's going to get their shots by October. So that's good news. And of course, the other thing is that, again, where a lot of people on Twitter were scoffing at the idea when Suga said that they were going to get up to 1 million shots per day, that was achieved earlier this week relatively easily and before the corporate vaccination started, which really, to me, given the number of companies that signed up to give their employees vaccinations, it really looks like Japan's going to probably pretty easily get up to like 2 million shots per day pretty soon, which again makes the getting the whole country done by November target, at least everyone who wants to do it, pretty achievable. So in that light, I guess what's going to be really interesting is to see how far it goes, because this is the other thing right now. There isn't a lot of talk about herd immunity or getting the whole country to 70% like there is in America and so on. I mean, America's further along at this, but it will be interesting to see how just based on pure availability and everyone who wants to get it, getting it, how far that will go. Again, people talk about vaccine hesitancy, and there are a lot of people, just the culture here is just a very cautious culture, and there's a lot of people who talk cautiously about it, but also peer pressure is a thing. And we'll see actually how many people go and actually allow themselves to go get the shot for themselves and their families, and where we end up come November. But right now, yeah, there's a lot of momentum, and I'm certainly going to go and get mine, so that's a good thing. The other thing that's happening, I think I mentioned last week that Japan was developing a paper-based vaccine passport system, which it is also planning to create a digital version of, and now they're reaching out to countries in Europe and other countries which are developing similar systems to set up reciprocity, basically to allow travel, to the idea of having Japanese being able to have a proof of having received their vaccines, which is recorded and validated by the Japanese government, that can be used in compatible digital passport systems with other countries, basically to reopen travel and trade and whatnot. And I think this makes sense, as a way to track that. Again, I'm generally for, I know there's some controversy with vaccine passports, but lots of countries require vaccines in order to enter them for other types of vaccines, and I'm satisfied that the vaccines that we're using here are safe. The Japanese government, among the issues that the Japanese government is trying to work out, for example, with countries like Indonesia, that are primarily using the Sinovac vaccine from China, which Japan doesn't recognize. There's a question, is Japan going to recognize vaccine passports for vaccines that it doesn't approve? They're going to have to sort that one out pretty fast, because again, with countries like Indonesia, there's a lot of exchange, and with China there's a lot of exchange. So they'll have to sort out a lot of the details and indeed check if there's going to be reciprocity. But if this opens the path to travel, safe travel, and knowing that you're not going to be stuck on an airplane where 30% of the people are unvaccinated. Not that, of course, vaccines are 100% protection, but if you're going to allow it, again, you'd rather have your chances. Particularly in the US, I saw some data that, apparently among the deaths in the US, 99% of the people who die of coronavirus are unvaccinated in the US. So, clearly the benefits of being vaccinated as opposed to not being vaccinated are clear, at least vis-a-vis the virus and in terms of immigration safety. That said, it's a requirement right now that most of the athletes coming in for the Olympics are all getting, well, not a requirement, but nearly all of them are vaccinated first. And yet already the Ugandan, the first team that arrived, the Ugandan team had 2 members that tested positive, even though they had both been vaccinated. I had the AstraZeneca shot just before arriving. Then you've had the French team, they had some cases. The Sri Lankan team had some cases. So already people are arriving, teams are arriving in Japan, and they're proving positive, even with vaccination. So, it's not foolproof at all. But, it'll be interesting to see if this is a way to allow faster reopening than would be possible without this, even when countries are still trying to tidy it up. That's really all the updates on coronavirus this week. Shubhas, no worries. Back into the comments. AV84K, thank you. Around 80 million in Germany. There we go. I got the numbers completely wrong there, so thank you for the correction. Dan H, the troublemaker. I'm curious what sort of troublemaker you were being there, although there again. Remember, everybody, if you want to get my attention, ask me a question, make a comment, or whatever, just say my name, Hiko Simon. You can see it flashes orange, and as I scan like this, I will stop and see people who are directing questions at me, but I will skip over all the other stuff because I don't want to get too held up. But AV84K, thank you for the correction. Quint Rankin, maybe just approved, but some vax will require booster shots and some may not. Some not effective against Delta. Indeed, it seems like the vaccines, the data that I'm seeing in the news says that they are not as effective. They are effective against the Delta variant, but not as effective. And the fact that it's more virulent is part of the problem, I suppose. By the way, I also see some more people rocking in. Just a quick hello to Simon Chilkowski, good to see you. Has it entered, how has the Delta variant entered Japan, given tight restrictions to enter Japan? Oh, through Japanese people. Japanese people are still coming back in all the time. And again, probably it was, I'm sure it would have been a Japanese person that probably brought it in from wherever they brought it in from. So there you go. Yep, I'm going to skip straight back. Good to see Shubis made it. And on to the next story. I'm only going to get through 2 stories at the top of the hour, but I do always pick the biggest topics first. So that is part of the thing. It will speed up as I go in. So second topic is what's going on with the Olympics. Well, it's been a kind of an interesting week. Again, it's all mostly just the same old sort of shenanigans. At the same time as the government's really identified that so many clusters and cases involve meeting people, gatherings. Clusters seem to involve gatherings that include alcohol. The speculation being, or at least the explanation given by the government, that alcohol tends to make people more likely to speak without masks and to speak loudly and to propel more. And so basically they are focusing on a kind of prohibitionist, like restricting alcohol sales as one way to control behavior that can lead to increased numbers of cases. Yet, for all of the restrictions on alcohol sales and serving and so on, the Minister for the Olympics said that they're not going to have restrictions on alcohol sales at Olympic venues, even though they're going to ask everyone not to cheer too loudly and to be quiet and subdued and not shout or anything like that. They are going to serve alcohol at the places, and the media criticized that, with everyone being sort of with alcohol sellers going out of business right now and bars being closed down and struggling to survive. How come it's going to be an open bar at the Olympics? And the Olympics minister said, well, one of the sponsors of the Olympics is the Asahi beer, so we have to treat the stakeholders. We have to take into account who the stakeholders for the Olympics are. And there was so much bashing that came out against Asahi for this, with people calling on, boycott Asahi if they're going to actually take what the government considers to be COVID, coronavirus risks, and the government's going to support it. Like, it was pretty much like they're paying to get around the rules, was pretty much the interpretation. Which forced a public statement by Asahi Beer later in the week that even though they are a sponsor of the Olympics, they'll abide by any decision not to restrict alcohol sales at the games. So that was a bit awkward for her. Another thing going on in Tokyo right now. In fact, I'll just stick with this for the Olympics news. That's the main one. The other one is, of course, that we've had delegations of athletes come in with cases already. They are in isolation. This is part of the plan that they're going to maintain that. It's not really so much, to me, a concern about whether athletes are going to bring it in. The concern is that when things start up, like with the village and with the 70,000 volunteers and the 110,000 visitors and running the events, are they going to be able to stop the events themselves from being clusters? And right now they're following the plan, which is that when athletes arrive, they are putting them into isolation. And it's a good thing, I guess, that athletes are arriving now, more than 3 weeks ahead, so that there's enough time to allow for quarantine. Probably for teams that show up any later than this, they could actually face being quarantined when their events are on. They are going into isolation anyway now, so we'll see what happens. But, still genuinely seems like a bad idea, and it genuinely looks like with cases spiking in Tokyo that they're going to have to cancel the plans to have spectators. Like, clearly, I think we're going to be in another state of emergency when this starts, and it's just silly to be carrying on like that. Back into the comments. Sainted Sir, good to see you. Hi indeed, and everybody else. The J-Vlog, good to see you. Salutations. No worries being late. I'm going to go on to the next topic. Which is actually right now, like tonight. In fact, I think it's today. There are Tokyo prefectural elections. So it's kind of like, if you live in Tokyo, it seems like there's always elections. You've got national elections where you've got upper house and lower house. You've got prefectural elections, which I guess are like states, if you live in Australia, or federal sort of systems. And although technically they're not full on states, they don't have the degree of sovereignty that states have, but they have their own separate governments here. I think they're actually like Landers in Germany. They're actually modeled on that similar sort of a system. So and then you've got local cities and councils and so on. So there's always some sort of election going on, and you've probably got 3 or 4 layers of elected representatives wherever you are in Japan. With current elections about to start, the governor has been hospitalized for basically exhaustion from overwork. And this is clearly a lot going on with the Olympics about to start, and with coronavirus sort of going crazy, and figuring out what to do with the restrictions, and trying to get the vaccinations going, and trying to set up Tokyo prefectural vaccination sites and whatnot. She just sort of collapsed from overwork. Yet at the same time, you have Tokyo elections happening right now. And within Tokyo, Tokyo politics basically is very similar to the national. It's the same political parties. It's the LDP, the Komeito, which is basically the Sokogakai, sort of Buddhist political arm, although they're not allowed to call themselves that because you're not supposed to have religious parties, but it is. And then you've got the Democrats, and you've got, but in Tokyo, you've actually got, Koike was originally in the LDP. She was actually a cabinet minister. And when she asked for the LDP to back her to run from Tokyo, and they said, no, we've got our old boy ready to go, she actually broke away and ran independently, and which was opposed by the Tokyo LDP chapter. So she basically left the party and set up a party around herself called, just like New Zealand First or Australia First or a lot of these sort of populist parties. She literally called it Tokyo People First Party, which is a bit alarming. Although that said, she's a conservative, but she's not a Pauline Hanson. She's actually proven to be a pretty good governor, and she seems pretty intelligent. Which sets her aside, I guess, from the Australian equivalent. But that said, right when this election's happening, she's got like in the parliament, although she is the governor, the Tokyo prefectural government is actually dominated still by the LDP and Komeito, the Buddhist party ally. They hate her guts. They hate her, and her party has like 30% of the seats. They're like the number 3 party. But basically, they're a party pretty much just centered around supporting Koike and her policies. And so it looks, I don't really understand how polls are showing the LDP is ahead, in the sense that, if you're against the Olympics or against the performance on vaccinations, you'd be against the governor, but you'd also be against the national government that's controlled by the LDP. However, the main opponent to the governor in Tokyo is the LDP, that's the national government, even though they're doing all the same stuff together, the Olympics and managing the coronavirus thing. But yeah, they're also the established local politicians. So yeah, interesting time right now. That said, last night, when news came out that she was hospitalized for overwork, in proof that only the good die young, the not young Taro Aso, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Japan, who has a gift for always saying the most inappropriate thing at any time, has said that, was asked what he thought about Koike passing out from overwork. He said the sympathetic words of, she's reaping what she sowed. She planted the seeds of her own misfortune, which I don't really get. He's saying that she did herself in from working too hard. Again, I must admit, I've talked before about how when I've seen him outside of politics, like reflecting, I remember watching some interviews of him talking about his time as Prime Minister, very self-deprecatingly and very humorously. And I actually thought, wow, this is actually kind of a guy I wouldn't mind actually. He'd be kind of fun to go out drinking with. Like he's a terrible human being and an awful politician, but he's actually, but he's basically that uncle, that just always says the most inappropriate thing at any given time. And sometimes, you have to quietly think that it's funny, but this isn't funny. I mean, this is just sort of nuts and mean. And again, you assume it's going to backfire, but it's not really clear how it is. But that's what's going on with the Tokyo election. So I guess we'll find out what's going to happen probably tomorrow. Maybe you'll find out next week. All that I know right now is that there's like so much noise. If you're hearing all the sound cars everywhere in Tokyo in front of the train stations, You got the communists everywhere. Communists are very big in Tokyo, by the way. The socialists used to be quite big, but they're not as big. The communists in Japan are sort of communist light. They're kind of nice. They're kind of democratic socialists by other country standards. But in Japan, they've always sort of prided themselves on being like the nicest, most electable communists in the world. They are the largest, certainly in Asia, and I think maybe of any country in the world, Japan has the largest opposition communist party. Mainly because when the communists win in other countries, they tend to shut down everything and not allow any more elections. But in Japan, they're just like a perpetual opposition party. And yes, even I don't care. Even they're making noise. So, for me, it's definitely none of the above, but that's what's going on with elections. Back into the comments. Dan H., do I see opposition parties or new political movements to get any significant gains in this upcoming election? No. In fact, it's actually remarkable that even as the approval ratings of the LDP plummet, the Democratic Party, rather than take advantage of that, instead, that these politicians come out advocating for statutory rape, and just like why are you even talking about that? And their ratings went down in the same proportion. There's no real new parties. Of course, there's always the game of establishing parties rebranding themselves. Like the anti-NHK party has rebranded themselves a couple of times, but honestly, they're just moving their chairs around, and none of them get any sort of meaningful votes. The main point of view from the opposition is that, or the main thing that people are looking at is that. Because there are so many opposition parties, it is pretty common for opposition parties to team together and agree to basically not dilute the opposition vote by having everybody competing. So basically the Democrats have cooperated with the communists, who have a pretty steady 15% vote minimum base in most places. And they've agreed that basically they wouldn't run against each other. They would choose which seats they would put up a candidate, and the parties would endorse the other candidates, which seems smart from an electoral, for increasing your chances to compete against an LDP sitting person and to beat them by not splitting your vote. But at the same time, just the fact that the Democrats are coordinating with the communists and endorsing communist candidates in other seats, themselves has actually caused people to sort of run away from them and go and support the LDP. And they're looking at the wisdom of that electoral cooperation. While it makes technical sense, it actually causes a lot of damage to the CDP as well, and it makes them appear unelectable. So there's some speculation, there's been some talk that they're going to break that up. But no, there's nothing really new happening, which is surprising. You'd say it's a prime opportunity for someone to come out with a new idea. I guess no one really wants to jump in to take over the government in the middle of a pandemic right now, even though people can certainly criticize what's happening. But good question, Dan H., as always. So yes, back into the comments. Remember, if you want to get my attention, do what Dan H. just did. Next topic, there was a Supreme Court case this week. It's gone on for a while. I've talked about it on the show before, about under the Japanese Civil Code and various other marriage-related laws, when you get married in Japan, if you are married between two Japanese people that both have a family register in Japan, which foreigners don't have, so this doesn't apply when you marry a foreigner or foreigners marry. It only applies to Japanese marrying Japanese, but that's 95% of the marriages in Japan. The law requires that the married couple has to choose basically which register to go on to, and it can be the man's or the woman's, although in more than 90% of the cases it's the man's, and I think it's actually the man's by default if you don't choose. So yeah, that's it. I know people actually have chosen their wife's family's register. This can happen for various reasons, for things like, someone like maybe the woman's family wanting someone to take over the family business, or maybe they're from maybe there are no other family members to sort of carry on the name and so on. And sometimes they ask for it. Sometimes I know people who've done it just because they hate their parents. But typically it just goes to the man. But of course, the idea that there are many people in Japan, even politicians in parliament right now, who refuse to officially marry because they don't want to lose their identity of their given name, and they don't want to, they don't believe either party should be forced to give up their name. They believe that people in Japan should have the same choice, as in most other developed nations anyway. to have either separate names or, there's actually less advocacy for things like hyphenated names and so on, like you see, but the debate is mainly focused around the ability for people to maintain separate names after marriage. Again, if you marry a foreigner, you actually need to apply to change your name to match up, so you actually have the opposite problem. It's a bureaucratic burden to have the same name. But, for Japanese people, marrying each other, they do not have the option to maintain separate names, and this has also been a problem. I believe some people have been appealing that the law which forces you to choose a family register is unconstitutional. Again, they've tried lobbying Parliament. The LDP hasn't shown interest in it. There's been internal conservative opposition to it, so they're not going to legislate it. So they're challenging it in court, saying that it violates the sort of human dignity, the human freedoms of Japanese people to not have this. And I believe there are also cases where Japanese have married abroad and come back to Japan and tried to have their marriage recognized without updating their family register, and that has also been rejected, again based on laws that require a single family register. So, they brought a case to the Supreme Court, which interestingly struck it down. They said that it isn't unconstitutional for a law to say that you have to pick a family register. It's not inherently unconstitutional anyway. That said, it was actually, I believe, a full bench, 15 judges sat on the trial giving the decision. On that bench, there were only two women, and both of the women gave dissenting opinions that it was unconstitutional. There were 4 people in total that issued dissenting opinions, which were also published, which is unusual. They don't always publish when there's a dissenting opinion. But some of the people who brought the case pointed out that if there were more women in the Japanese Supreme Court, that indicates that probably there would have been more people who would have agreed with their view that it's unconstitutional. Which is a fair point. I mean, this is, again, Japan ranking 127th on gender equality, including representation in the legal profession and on the bench. And this is exactly the sort of thing. You've got a gender-related court case, and the outcome fell along gender lines, where there's only 2 out of 15 Supreme Court justices the men didn't see a problem with it, and you ended up with this outcome. Just for reference, the news was indicating that apparently Germany was the last OECD country that actually required the shared surnames, which they changed, I believe, in the early 2000s, and Thailand changed the law to allow this themselves, I believe, a few years ago. Again, highlighting that Japan is sort of lagging in this sort of area. And you talk about how Japan's sort of wondering why it's always lagging behind on these gender rankings and so on, yet when it has the opportunity to actually do things to foster equality, it steadfastly opposes doing so. So, it kind of shows that I think the Japanese government just really doesn't understand what that really means. This is exactly the sort of challenge for the government to improve its ranking, to actually do something to promote that. And for now it's not changing, but interesting to see. Back into the comments, Karoshi, there's people talking about that. There is no new comments aimed at me, so I'm going to dive back into it. Population statistics just got released based on the census for last year, and found that the population dropped by 850,000. That would be way too many. Was that what it was? Was it 85,000 or 800? It might have been 850,000. Certainly, Japan has dropped. There we go. It dropped. Oh, in fact, the number of newborns dropped to 840,000. But there we go. The population dropped by 868,000 from 2015. And Japan is no longer in the top 10 most populous nations in the world. It is remarkable. I mean, again, when you think about the whole history of the 20th century, the modernization of Japan. Japan was a bit very similar. I mean, there's so many parallels between Japan and the UK, including how the Industrial Revolution and the improvements in medicine that happened, particularly in the 19th century and 20th century with Japan's modernization, meant that because infant mortality was just such a thing, it was pretty typical. And doing a bit of genealogy myself on UK history, it's pretty common that I remember, when I was looking at my own sort of family history and people up in Yorkshire in the 16th and 17th century, and I remember seeing that there was a time when the family there were registered 12 registered kids, and 4 of them were called John, and I thought it was hilarious that they couldn't think of a name other than John. But then you realize when you looked at it, most of the Johns didn't make it past a few months, so they really wanted a John. The father's name was John, so they kept naming the next kid, hoping that they would take on. Only like out of 12 kids born, only 4 of them actually survived infancy to grow up. Like in this particular family that I saw, it was actually kind of dark. And it was the same in Japan. Everyone was used to having lots of kids, but also used to most of the kids not surviving. So when medicine and standard of living and everything improved dramatically in the 19th century and the 20th century, the population exploded because everyone was used to having 12 kids and not all of them surviving, and all of a sudden they all survived. UK, you had the overpopulation, which led to Britain going on a bit of a rampage with the British Empire and setting up colonies, which were basically, transportation was a solution for overpopulation. America exists and Australia exists because of these sorts of things. Me being born where I was born is because of this. Japan didn't have an empire. This is the thing. Japan, by the 1920s, was incredibly overpopulated. In a very short period of time, the population exploded, and they didn't have anywhere to go. And they wanted to do what everyone else did. They wanted to grab some land to go and put people on. So very, very connected to World War II and all the events of the 20th century, the population explosion in Japan. And also, Japan really, without being as coercive as China, took the initiative for really getting population down from the 70s, but, now falling precipitously. I mean, losing nearly 1 million people a year right now. And people are saying that, probably by 2040s or 2050s, I remember seeing some estimate that Japan could be down to like, 70 million people, actually, based on current rates of decline and the demographics. So certainly, falling a lot. And again, some other articles reflecting on this, saying that, again, given one, do you have to maintain population is an interesting question. Do you need immigration to replace the falling population? It sort of is given as a given that in order to maintain economic growth, in order to maintain, and presumably from economic growth, the well-being of the economy and all the people, that you have to maintain population at least. Yeah, at the same time, Japan's kind of not really trying to do that. As you can see, it is increasing immigration dramatically, but not at the same levels that population is declining. And it seems that the policy in Japan is to manage the decline down to that number. And, Japan's the same size as New Zealand, the same size as UK, the same size as California, and it has 120 million people. So even 70 million people would still be quite a lot given the space of land. I do feel like Japan is still always missing out on the opportunity to manage the population decline in a way that improves the standard of living for everybody left. Like, for example, the problem with abandoned houses and no one having a plan for what to do with them to improve living space and so on. But it is a fact that, certainly the idea that Japan became a major world power in spite of its size and lack of resources simply because everyone was used to having a lot of kids, and medicine improved all of a sudden, during the Meiji period. And that led to its sort of its superpower status. That is not going to happen again. Japan's going to keep declining, at least in terms of population ranking. And and the countries that are going to be the next superpowers, again, you look at the numbers, are going to be increasingly in what we consider now to be developing world countries. Could very well be 21st century, 22nd century countries like Nigeria. Could very well become global superpowers. Theoretically, that's what they should be. Countries like India, I suppose, already should be, but they're not. But certainly I think interesting times, and certainly interesting to see that Japan is continuing to decline in that regard. Into the comments. Good night, Andrea Moboy. Have a good night there. Dan H. Are there any updates on Takashi Tachibana, the man who got elected to get rid of NHK? He's advocated genocide a couple of times. He's kind of unhinged. I think he's actually been medically diagnosed with issues, although he still is elected. He's changed the name of his party a couple of times as well, including to the Party to Protect Japan from Old Parties or something like that, I think. But he had got someone else in parliament to join his party, who then advocated invading Russia while in Russia on a trip of parliamentarians. Again, bad enough that you're advocating it, but if you do advocate it, don't advocate it in the country that you're planning to invade. That's just bad strategy. He's a bit of him, and everything around him just is a bit of a clown, I'm afraid. Dan H. Down here, Quint Rankett, economic growth or government pyramid schemes? Who knows how they'll sustain it. Christopher Luke, it's kind of funny that all the science fiction always makes Japan the overpopulated place in the future. Well, I guess, a lot of great science fiction came from the 80s, and if you were at that time and still drawing lines, people in the 70s had stopped making babies, but there was still that hadn't really started to impact on the population yet, right? It wasn't until those people who were having kids in the 70s are now getting to the age of mortality that it's actually that their lack of kids to follow after them is now affecting the population. So yeah, I think it was people drawing lines when Japan's economic bubble was on a trajectory like the vaccine line. It was going to overtake everybody, and everyone made these movies about Japan economically dominating at this time, which obviously wasn't the case. Population dominating, everyone was looking at the sort of growth of technology. Again, it just shows that there's so many things that everyone presumes that you just you can't join line. It's a trap to think you can join dots on a graph and make a line, and that's going to be an accurate prediction of what's to come. Japan's a great example of that. The curve has not been what's preceded. Doesn't mean I think that Japan still can't be awesome. I mean, again, I'm still pretty comfortable being here, but yeah, it's true. That a lot of the science fiction definitely overestimated Japan's position and influence in the future. AV84K, how did that guy go from NHK license fees to genocide? Well, apparently it's NHK fees are a bit of a gateway drug. I mean, NHK pretty much jumped on it the moment that they started advocating genocide and invading Russia, as you can understand, because they want to keep collecting the NHK fee. So why wouldn't you point that out? Yeah, he looks a bit unhinged. He's also, by the way, an anti-vaxxer, I believe. So there's issues with him. Although I always liked his YouTube channel where he would give strategies for basically not paying NHK. I pay NHK, by the way, but I thought it was just interesting to see. I thought he constructed pretty good arguments, and I agree. It's the same in most countries. The whole broadcast feast thing, that it's like it's weird. It's not a tax. Just make it a tax. It's not a tax, though. It's like a mandatory contract that you don't sign, but you're forced to comply with by force of law, but it's like a private contract. I mean, it's a screwed up system, if you ask me. As a lawyer, it really seems pretty tenuously valid. There's a whole thing in law that you're not bound by a contract that you're not a party to, that you don't actually sign. That's how contract law works. The elements of a contract: offer, acceptance, certainty, intent to form contractual relations, and consideration. Yeah, there's no how can you be told that you were forced to sign a contract that you didn't intend to join, or that you didn't sign, that there's no certainty of what the terms of it are, just by a law? It's a really strange system. So I agreed with him in that. I enjoyed his channel, but he seems to be nuts. That's unfortunately where things have gone. Anyway, next story. Tokyo falls to the world's fourth most expensive city for expats. A lot of people, including myself, looked at this and thought, how is Japan even high on this ranking? I find when I go back to Australia or New Zealand now, what's happened the whole time I've been in Japan is, of course, Japan has gone through deflation. If anything, stuff is the same or cheaper than it was in 1998 when I arrived here. Rents, food, most stuff. I mean, it wasn't cheap. In fact, when I arrived here, it was probably a little bit more expensive than New Zealand to live in Tokyo, like average rents, average groceries and whatever. But things in New Zealand and Australia, rents, food, has become way more expensive than Japan. And my salary here is much better than in New Zealand. I think salaries have gone up in Australia too, but again, I think now, just because of deflation, living as a normal person in Tokyo, the average cost of living in Tokyo is nothing like the most expensive in the world. So I expect that, Turkmenistan's capital being number one and other places being this expensive is more on what they consider an expat's lifestyle is. Probably mandating, probably having a maid, I would guess, to be this high up the ranking, but being in a big house in a centrally located apartment or house or whatever, and being able to have a car and a double garage or something like that. Sure, no one has that here. So yeah, you got to be like a billionaire, and if that's the standard, then Tokyo is an expensive city to be an expat. But to be like a foreign resident, if you just live like a normal person here, which is perfectly comfortable, Tokyo is not this expensive at all. Different stuff is expensive. I'm stuck thinking of New Zealand in the 1990s. So, and every time I've gone back now, I've discovered that I always thought in Tokyo, electronics were cheap and cars were cheap and so on, but basics like food and so on was expensive. Whereas now food is more expensive in New Zealand, rents are more expensive. So now everything is more expensive back there. But yeah. Anyway, that's a bit of a mysterious outcome to me how it got to that, but that's what that is. Checking the comments again, nothing in the comments. So, oh, by the way, good to see Guys English World. NHK now broadcast, by the way, on the internet, and they're going to use that as a basis to claim anyone with a mobile phone or a computer. So you're not going to get out of it, and they'll say that you signed up to a contract to do it, even though you didn't. But yeah. Slight thing I think I mentioned last week, how Toshiba tried to rig the shareholders meeting to prevent a Singapore-based US hedge fund activist shareholder to make propose votes on certain items for Toshiba's annual shareholders meeting. Toshiba went to the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and said, hey, is there some way to block these activist shareholders from interfering with our business? Not because they thought they shouldn't be accountable to shareholders, but the pretext that they used is that Toshiba actually has a lot of very sensitive semiconductor and nuclear power plant construction businesses and technology. And they were concerned that foreign activist shareholders could have intents that, were contrary to Japanese national security interests. And the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry decided to look in and actually, look at the ability of this shareholder to operate in Japan and question their business to check if they were a national security threat. Toshiba later admitted, or an investigation, a third-party independent inquiry into Toshiba, found that, this was basically a pretext that was used by the company simply to block an activist investor from putting proposals that were contrary to the views of management and the proposals of management, i.e. they were just challenging management. And the result of this has been that this week they reheld the shareholders meeting, and the shareholders voted to get rid of the general chair, the AGM, Well, that's the annual general meeting, but they decided to actually fire the chair of Toshiba for basically trying to rig the previous shareholder meeting. So they kicked him out. But in the meantime, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry says, no, they weren't colluding to stop foreign participation, shareholders from exercising their shareholder rights. In fact, now they actually are being so adamant that they had valid concerns about national security from abusive shareholders that they are actually thinking about now even passing laws to actually restrict the ability of shareholders, foreign shareholders, to make proposals or interfere with companies that have national security interests to Japan, which is fair enough. But there again, you're still talking about a pretext for limiting the reason that you sell shares is to raise funds. And if you accept the funds, you're giving those shareholders certain rights, including challenging the way that the company is run. So the idea that you would restrict those shareholder rights for national security when the company sold the shares, in order to, it was the exchange was that you're selling the shares with those rights and the say in how the company is run. You're selling an ownership in the company in exchange for the money, in order to raise funds. So Toshiba took the funds and they were in financial trouble, but they don't want the foreign shareholders to have the rights that they gave to the foreign shareholders. And the government's agreeing with Toshiba on this. I think if the government is so freaked out about foreign shareholders interfering in sensitive national security interest companies, the Japanese government should buy out the foreign shareholders at a premium. Because otherwise it's basically breaking a contract and violating shareholder rights. And again, it sort of shows that the government again is really it's a bit like China. They really don't want to allow genuine capitalism. Lysander 45, yes, the old men of the company cannot be denied. They spent too many years miserable, never seeing their wives foreigners. Well, that's a bit what it sounds like, yes. Dan H saying something up there as well. Kerberos Tenchi, is Tokyo expensive? Have people tried living in Munich or Berlin or even worse, Frankfurt? So I think it's not the average cost of living though, and Guy is agreeing with me. Food is and rent is way more expensive in New Zealand. It is now. I don't think they're talking about the average cost of living. They're talking about the cost of living for expats, but I assume they're assuming some pretty high living expats. So yeah, I think that's right. I think Dan H, that's exactly what they're thinking about for that. Anyway, a couple of stories left to go. First one is The Economist actually comments on there is a big new National Ainu Museum being launched in Hokkaido. And I've been to a couple of Hokkaido sort of towns, and I've seen the sort of museums that they have up in Hokkaido, and it's worthwhile seeing. Again, it's very reminiscent of going to a place like Rotorua in New Zealand, where you have a lot of very structured touristy sort of indigenous culture, tourism for New Zealand, and Ainu are very much. You see all the similarities immediately with Maori in New Zealand, both in the way that they've been treated and their history. At the same time as New Zealand was having the land wars between the colonists and the Maori, Japan was having similar land wars with the Ainu up in Hokkaido, and basically leaving them in a similar sort of a position, except in Hokkaido, rather than sort of agreeing that they would have like even the pretense of mutual sovereignty and mutual respect, Japan just basically subjugated and said, okay, you're all Japanese now, so the idea being that legally you're not different, we're not going to discriminate against you, you're all Japanese, but the Ainu don't exist anymore. And that's how it was pretty much for like 100 years, until I believe his name is Shigeru Kayano. There was an Ainu member of parliament who advocated, much like in Wales and in New Zealand, for the revitalization of Ainu language and culture. And that went on to things like nationally funded museums and whatnot. But of course, the thing is that the museums are telling the history from the perspective more of the national government narrative, really, than the Ainu themselves, and certainly not talking about the history sort of injustice and the forcing onto land reservations, and subjugation of their culture, more about the actual history of sorry, my nose has been so itchy the whole time I can't stop scratching it. Not so much the negatives, more about that the Ainu are these very, very happy people who fish and live in northern Japan, and they've been around for a long time, and not really talking about the very complicated history of how they were colonized and subjugated, again, just really fascinating. There isn't a clear understanding of whether, for example, there are some people who say that Ainu are people who just migrated south from like Kamchatka and Russia, and weren't in Japan for a long time, whereas most people in Japan seem to think, I'm not actually sure what the genetics say on this, that these are the people that actually predated the Chinese and Korean Yamato Japanese who came in around, just after 600 AD. That these were basically the same as the predating Jomon and Yayoi people who lived in Japan, that were separate civilizations that predated the modern Japanese culture, and that these are the ancestors and legacy of that culture. Of course, Ainu did live in Honshu. They were gradually pushed up as Yamato pushed into Japan. Really fascinating subject, and and a culture and a people, the whole history of the way that Ainu are perceived within Japan and globally. And particularly come into focus in light of the discriminatory TV show that was on National Public TV a couple of weeks ago, which caused a bit of a fuss. So, certainly I'd love to go and see the museum, and I'd love to go back to Lake Akanko up in Hokkaido and see those areas again. But just a fascinating culture. It's something you don't realize is there, and very much so the fact that Polynesians have been traced through genetics and through Lepida pottery to actually being connected to the indigenous people of Taiwan. And similarly here, Native North Americans are basically very closely genetically linked. I mean, these are the people that walked across the Bering Strait into North America. These were the people who were living in the area that they walked across from. And again, the Ainu museums that I saw talked about how there was clearly trade between Japan and the northwest of America. And Canada, going back hundreds of years. So, they were connected with North American indigenous people as well for a very long time, and separately to the Japanese that we think of, to the Yamato Japanese. So really interesting on that. J-Vlog indeed. They've been through a lot of shit, again, like very similar to the experience of indigenous peoples in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, America. The variations to the story, of course, unique features in every place. The fact that in Japan, many Japanese deny that they're even legitimate indigenous people, that they see them as sort of Russian, Kamchatka tribes that came south, and there's the debate around that, although that looks like it's being on the way to being settled, that these aren't genuinely actual the Yayoi and Jomon people that predated Yamato Japanese. But yeah, even that, in the way that they were treated is clearly, there's a lot going on there. BTT Chiba, boom, good to see you. And Sergeant Bilko, maybe they should split off a sensitive business to be a sensitive entity. Yeah, well, again, that's what it looks like the government is sort of, they should be doing, rather than just ripping off people after they, fairly purchase something. I mean, does the Japanese government want international investment? Do they, or not? They sort of want to have their cake and eat it too. Final story from the night is I've been watching on YouTube some really great videos I want to recommend. I put all these out on Twitter tonight, so if you want to go and catch the links to these, I highly recommend it. Check out my Twitter, and these were just shared just before the show tonight. 4 videos I really recommend. First one is this. I've talked about this channel before, Voices of the Past, where they read in English the first-person accounts of different historical features translated into English, but basically it sort of is autobiographical. So this is the Iwakura Embassy back in the Meiji period when Japan was just opening up. Rather than having established fixed embassies, like we think of embassies today in every country, Japan basically sent around these tours of diplomats that would go around Europe, and in each country, they would meet the Queen of England and the Kaiser Wilhelm, and they go around. In this case, it was actually Bismarck that they met. And meet all these sort of amazing, historical sort of figures in person. And these were the accounts written in Japanese of the Japanese, going to these countries for the first time, which must have been like going to an alien planet and meeting these people and recording the reactions that was had to them and how they perceived and how they learned about Europe and the characteristics of the different colonial powers and how Japan looked at Western colonialism as they were learning about it themselves from the Europeans. In 1872. It's a long video, but it's just really fascinating, and they were quite astute as to, and you can see a lot of Japan really just chose to ally with Britain and to emulate Prussia. And part of the reason that they emulated with Prussia, it's pretty clear from listening to this, is that they were impressed by the Prussians talking about how they were obsessed with fighting for independence. They didn't have an empire like the other big countries in Europe, and they were just fighting for their existence. And that they would be a good friend to Japan because they warned Japan that you should be worried about the other colonial powers that just take land everywhere else, whereas Prussia will help them remain independent. That was the pitch. Of course, if you know about the history of Prussia and Germany, you know that they totally wanted to have an empire too and catch up for time, but that was a sales pitch that they made to Japan that clearly won Japan over. Various other fantastic video, just really fascinating. So highly recommend that. If you're not on Twitter, just look these up. Pause it anyway. Japan on Colonialism and Empire from this is Voices of the Past channel. That's the first one. Second one is Unseen Japan. Has put up a great video, again part of a series going into a lot of depth on the Japanese Red Army. If you think the Japanese are apathetic about politics, that's all that I ever talk about. Go back to the 1960s and the 1970s, and Japanese, were basically like more extremist than the Chinese Red Brigades. Like Japanese students were batshit crazy. I mean, mass murdering, bombing, hijacking planes, doing all sorts of crazy shit. And basically, this is a fantastic documentary. It goes into a lot of detail as to how these student movements became so radicalized and how they became so much more focused and more extreme over time, and how this connected to the airplane hijackings, the massacres, the bombings, and so on, and eventually into imploding. It still is mind-blowing looking at Japan today to think that Japanese had such radical youth politics, as well as that it produced groups like this. Really fascinating. Episode 1, just really fascinating. Highly recommended, actually, just for and I've mentioned this before, but the Kento Bento channel, they mentioned the Japan Airlines Flight 351 hijacking. It was a flight from Tokyo to Fukuoka that some Red Army terrorists took over and flew to North Korea. And this was this is a detail just on that one event, but that event is also covered in the history of the Red Army here, and it's just really fascinating to understand. And finally, a channel that I discovered recently. This is kind of dark. This channel called Linfamy. They put out pretty regular, weekly animated, quite humorous, but also quite dense and full of history from the Japanese sort of Middle Ages, and particularly the culture of that sort of time. Really fascinating. The history of Japan dealing with the Mongols, and sort of like the bit of a snarky sort of a tone about it, how Japan was basically ghosting Kublai Khan and he couldn't handle it, and he kept sending over envoys, and Japan kept responding by chopping their heads off. And it's a really well done channel. If you like Japan, and I'm not like a Japan history freak, but this is a really great way to learn Japanese history. Linfamy, Linfamy. They did have this video like about a week ago. That I didn't know anything about this. There was this practice called mabiki. The practice of killing your own baby. To be fair, it wasn't always killing your own baby. It was a job that they would give to the midwife. That the midwife's job was delivering and dispatching babies, and you would basically decide. Apparently, again, back in the days when they, when they had trouble feeding people was part of the reason, and sometimes just as literally a form of birth control, that people just said, you know what, we've had enough kids for now. Apparently, babies were not considered human until like a few days after the birth. So there was like a time when you could do like a final trimester. I mean, that's kind of how they looked at it, kind of an abortion after they were alive, and apparently it was a thing. And it was something like the first thing that the parents would be asked after the birth was, you want to keep it? And sometimes they would say, yeah, you know what, we'll skip this one, and the midwife would take care of it. Crazy shit. But again, the channel, I mean, this is a super dark one, but there's a whole lot of videos about the history and so on of the time, and the style is actually very, very watchable. So highly recommended. Infamy, Voices of the Past, and Unseen Japan, and this latest documentary on the Red Army, as well as Kento Bento, which doesn't put up videos very often, but it's awesome. Those are my recommended videos. As usual, I am 10 minutes over. Who cares? Good to see another person there in the comments. I'm going to wrap up now. Final comments in here. I'm going to see, indeed, got the J-Vlog before. Cobras Tenchi, did I watch the Engineering Explained video on Tesla's 0 to 60? No, I did not. I don't think so. I'll check it out. I mean, this is the 1.96 seconds 0 to 60, right? Thank you for the recommendation, Cobras Tenchi. I am interested in that. Dan H., the UK's Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, which is a levy board funded by farms, made a report about the wholesale price of butter. Thank you for the update on the world wholesale price of butter. I'll bet it's artificially high in Japan is what it is. Panasonic buying Blue Yonder and selling their shares in Tesla. I didn't talk about that. Apparently, you know what, that's crazy. They bought those shares for $30 million and they sold them for $3.6 billion. So they did pretty well on the sale, and they didn't do it because they don't believe in the future of Tesla. Obviously, they're making all the batteries for all the Tesla cars, so they're still pretty tied up with Tesla, but they just wanted the money for strategic investments, including digital transformation, which the Japanese government's going crazy on. So it actually kind of makes sense, the investment. You would recommend a video called Why the Japan Tech Industry Fell Behind. I'm going to make a note of that. Thank you for the recommendation. I'm going to check out both of those recommendations, so thank you for those. It's there in the comments and I can watch it back after, so on the replay, so thank you for that. Final comments. Good show. Thank you, Sergeant Bilko and One Johnson. Good luck with the vaccination. Well, we'll see how it goes. I don't know when I'm going to get it yet, but yes, 10 minutes over as always, but didn't have much to talk about, but I did have a lot to talk about. It always happens this way. You know how it goes. Have a good weekend. Have a good week, everybody. The weekend is over, well, in Japan anyway. Enjoy the rest of your weekend if you're in the rest of the world. Stay safe. You know, don't drink, and I mean, I don't even know what the advice is anymore. I think that if I put together all the coronavirus advice here, it would be pretty contradictory. Stay safe, take care of each other, have a good week. Remember, follow me on Twitter if you want to follow me. If you like the video, remember to like. It does help the channel and I do appreciate it. If you like the content and you're not subscribed, subscribe. Why not? But yeah, have a good week, and see you all same time next week. Boom. Peace.